Welcome to Saturday Morning Classics. We are currently reading Charnel House by Graham Masterton, and this week we're reading Chapter 5. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back and relax, and enjoy the story. Chapter 5. I was hardly conscious. A chunk of door jamb had struck me on the left side of my head, and my legs had given way beneath me. I was lying against the side of the corridor, shrouded in tattered carpet, and it seemed that the whole world was coming down around me. The hot hurricane howled and shrieked, and pieces of debris tumbled and flew down the corridor. Over it all, as Coyote approached us, I heard a noise like someone screaming down an endless echoing pipe, a hopeless, dreary screaming that frightened me more than almost anything else. Screwing up my eyes against the scorching wind, I tried to look up. I could see George Thousand-Names sprawled against the opposite wall, and Lieutenant Stroud huddled beside him. Dr. Jarvis was further away, his hands clutched over his gingery hair, but I couldn't see Dr. Weston at all. Then the very air itself seemed to darken, and out of the darkness came something that wasn't much to do with Brian Corder and Dan Matchin anymore. It was a spectral manifestation, a ghost made of eerie density and contorted flesh. It had a kind of negative glow to it, the glow of deep shadows or gloomy rooms, and it glided darkly down the corridor, the skull with its hideous grin, and behind it a rippling and loathsome cloak of half-substantial flesh. The screaming grew drearier and louder as Coyote went by, but there was yet another sound which accompanied his passing. It was the flap of dead skin, like flaccid tarpaulin on a deserted warehouse roof. It was almost more than I could bear. The noise and the wind seemed to drone on forever, but suddenly I raised my head again, and I became aware that Coyote had passed us by without harming us. I looked up a little more and turned round to check behind me, and the demon had vanished. George Thousand-Names whispered dryly, "I think it's all right now, at least for a while. He's gone to search for his blood." "How do you know that?" asked Lieutenant Stroud. "Because he would have killed us otherwise, and taken great pleasure in raping Dr. Weston. He needs his blood to stay alive, and if he doesn't get it in one moon's rising and descending, he'll be banished back to the underworld." Lieutenant Stroud, clutching his back, stood up against the wall. "Well, that's the first piece of good news I've heard all day. All we have to do is keep Coyote away from innocent bystanders for 24 hours, and that's the end of that." George Thousand-Names brushed off his windbreaker. "I'm afraid not, Lieutenant. Whatever you do, Coyote will make sure that he finds his blood." I said, "What about his face? His face was on the door knocker." "He'll go searching for that, too." "But I just sent Jane off to get that." George Thousand-Names stared at me, and his face was totally grave. "You sent Jane to get the door knocker? You mean that?" I felt panicky. "Well, sure, I just thought that if he didn't have his face," George Thousand-Names said. "Great Spirit preserve us. If Coyote catches her with that thing, she won't stand a chance." Lieutenant Stroud came forward, and he looked impatient. "I'm sorry to interrupt the ominous warnings, but what did you mean about the blood? That blood should be locked up at Redwood City by now. Isn't that right, Doctor? How's Coyote going to find it, let alone get a hold of it?" "Oh, come on, Lieutenant," I said, equally testy. "Coyote just burst his way through 3 inches of toughened glass." "I didn't ask you," retorted Lieutenant Stroud sharply. "I was asking our resident expert." "Well, the answer to your question is that Coyote is a dog monster of sorts," said George Thousand-Names. "He has a supernatural ear and a supernatural sense of smell. The old legend said that when Bear Maiden was hiding in a cave, Coyote was able to smell her through 10 spear lengths of solid rock, and he destroyed the cave and half the mountain to find her. That was supposed to have happened on Nacimiento Peak, more years ago than even the Navajos can remember. Lieutenant Stroud looked grim. Thanks for the optimistic forecast. What are you going to do now? I asked him. The first damn thing I'm going to do is call in the SWAT squad. We're going to find that whatever it is and give it a dose of what it just handed out to us. Lieutenant, put in George Thousand Names, I thought you were a sophisticated man, at least more sophisticated than most policemen. What's that supposed to imply? The old Indian looked at the detective cold and level. Your massive firepower is useless. Would you hunt a fox with a tank? Or try to kill a mosquito with a machine gun? Coyote is too cunning for you, Lieutenant, too powerful, too elusive. What you must do is track him down in the way that the ancient gods used to, by appealing to his lust and his vanity, and by coaxing him into engineering his own destruction. Are you kidding? Said Lieutenant Stroud. When I have to make my report about this, I'm going to have to say what immediate and decisive action I took. I can just think what the commissioner's going to say when he reads that I appealed to the fugitive's lust and vanity and coaxed him into engineering his own destruction. Now, if you'll excuse me. The lieutenant went across to an office close by and picked up the telephone. He rattled the handset a few times and then eventually got through. As he called up reinforcements, George Thousand Names looked at Dr. Jarvis and me and shrugged. You can never explain to a white man, he said. I said, what about Jane? Can we do something to help her? Of course, replied the Indian. In fact, the best plan for you and I right now is to go to this house on Pilarcito Street and seal it off from Coyote with the strongest spells we can. If he hasn't got there already, he'll try to steal the door knocker, and he'll also try to get to those pictures of Mount Taylor and Cabazon Peak. Why's that? Asked Dr. Jarvis. Simple. He wants the hair that he cut from Big Monster. Once he finds it, his immortality will be assured. We will never be able to destroy or dismiss him then. All right, I said. What are we waiting for? As we left the front door of the hospital, the first of the SWAT trucks and cars were arriving, and the night was howling and warbling with sirens. We walked quickly across the car park to Dr. Jarvis's Monte Carlo, and Dr. Jarvis held the front seat forward so that I could climb awkwardly into the back. As he stood there, he glanced up at the roof of the hospital and said, The birds, they're gone. George Thousand Names seemed to take it all very calmly. As he eased himself into the front passenger seat, he said, Of course, they have followed Coyote. They hang over his head like a cloud of sorrow. Sometimes they seem to fill the air with like heavy smoke, and other times they are almost invisible. Birds are very magical and strange creatures, Dr. Jarvis. They have spirits of a supernatural kind that men can rarely understand. Jim Jarvis started the motor, and we drove out of the hospital gates and into the streets of midnight San Francisco. It was a warm, clogged night, and the city lights sparkled and rippled through air that was almost unbreathably humid. Although it was late, it was Saturday night, and there were still plenty of cars cruising around and couples walking down the sloping streets. As we sped along 17th Street as far as Dolores Street, I suddenly glimpsed a girl in a red blouse and white jeans on the sidewalk. I yelled, "Jim, that's Jane! I'm sure that's Jane! Pull over!" Dr. Jarvis swung the car into the curbside and then backed up. I looked frantically through the tinted back window, and Jane came into view. She was walking steadily and purposefully in the direction of Mission Street, and she hadn't even turned our way. Dr. Jarvis bipped his car horn, and it was only then that she stopped and frowned in a dazed kind of way and came over to the curb. Dr. Jarvis climbed out of the car, and I squeezed myself out after him. I went around the front of the car and took Jane by the arms and held her. She was pale, and her eyes had a moist, myopic look about them, but otherwise she seemed okay. I said, Jane, what's wrong?" She smiled, but somehow she didn't seem to be concentrating. "There's nothing wrong," she whispered. "Nothing wrong at all." "But why didn't you take a taxi? What are you doing here?" "Here?" she said, raising her head and looking at me vaguely. "This is 17th. You were supposed to be going to Pilarcitos in a taxi." Jane touched her forehead as if she was trying to remember. "Oh, yes, Pilarcitos Street." Dr. Jarvis pushed me gently away and examined Jane with swift professionalism. He raised one of her eyelids with his thumb and checked her pulse. While he was doing this, she stood there silent and passive, her only expression a faint frown, her eyes staring off into some private distance that I couldn't even guess at. "Is she all right?" I asked him. "She seems like she's suffering from shock." "It could be shock," said Dr. Jarvis. "On the other hand, it could be a form of hypnosis or trance. Do you think Coyote—" "John, I don't know what I'm supposed to think, but the main thing is that she's safe. Let's get her into the car and get up to Pilarcitos Street. Then your Indian friend here can do what he has to do to keep Coyote out of the house, and we can get Jane back to the hospital." George Thousand Names stuck his head out of the car window. "Are we going to be long?" he asked me. "The quicker we get to that house, the better. If Coyote has gotten there already, we won't stand a chance." Between us, Jim Jarvis and I helped Jane to climb into the back seat of the car, and then we swerved off from the curb and made our way towards Mission Street and Pilarcitos. As we came up the sloping street, the house at 1551 looked as dark and brooding as it ever had before. The windows were like sunken eyes, and the scabrous paintwork seemed to have flaked even more. Dr. Jarvis slowed the car as we came near, and as we stopped outside, he switched off the motor, and we sat there for almost a minute in silence. "Do you think Coyote's in there?" I said, in an unsettled voice. "It's impossible to say," answered George Thousand Names, "but if he is, we'll soon find out." "How?" "He'll kill us." Dr. Jarvis wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "But he may not be there, right? He may still be looking for Seymour Wallace's blood?" "Of course." I looked at Dr. Jarvis, and Dr. Jarvis looked at me. "Well," I said wryly, "here goes nothing." We got out of the car and then went around to help George Thousand Names. Jane stayed where she was, silent and presumably shocked. The three of us crossed the sidewalk and stood by the front gate of 1551, looking up at the gloomy porch and the scaly lintels. "Is the door knocker still there?" asked George Thousand Names. "I find it hard to see without my eyeglasses." Dr. Jarvis and I peered into the shadows. At first I thought it had gone, but then I caught the dark gleam of bronze, and I knew that Coyote was still off pursuing his blood. For the moment, we were safe. We opened the creaking gate and went up the steps. George Thousand Names stood for a while looking at the evil, grinning face on the door knocker, and then he slowly shook his head. If any Indian had ever walked past this house and seen this face, he would have known immediately what it was. He said quietly, "This is just as provocative as having an effigy of Satan on your door. Well, let's make sure that Coyote can never use it." He reached into his windbreaker and lifted out an amulet. It was a small gold medallion with a strange pictograph scratched on it. He held it for a moment in the fingers of both hands and touched it against his forehead. Then he stepped right up to the door knocker and raised his hand. "Evil coyote, devilish one of the southwest," he muttered, "this likeness is forever bound by my spell, forever locked away from you. This likeness will burn you. This likeness will freeze you. This likeness will blow like the winds of the north against you. You may never touch this likeness, never use this likeness, without the wrath of the great spirits falling upon you forever." There was silence. A truck banged and rumbled across a distant road junction. Then, softly, I heard a hissing sound. It was like someone drawing breath, someone about to speak. A gentle, insidious voice said, "Fools." I felt myself shaking. I knew it was stupid to tremble like that, but it was the door knocker, the bronze door knocker itself, that was speaking. Its wild eyes shone with a lurid light, and maybe it was imagination working overtime, but I knew this time that it was bristling with hairs, and that its teeth were as savage and sharp as any real wolf or dog. George Thousand-Names stood upright. It was clear that he was making a fierce mental effort to stay in control of the situation. He crossed his arms in front of his face and then made a sweeping, dismissive gesture. "Coyote is a dog that runs in the night," he said. His voice was shaking with dignity and stern passion. "Coyote is a dog that runs in the night," he said. His voice was shaking with dignity and stern passion. "Coyote is a sneak and a liar. The gods hear this, and the gods know this. They dismiss you. They dismiss you. They dismiss you." There was a chilling laugh from the door knocker. "Silence!" shouted George Thousand-Names. "I command you to be silent." Again there was that hissing and another hideous laugh. "You have no power over me, you dotard," whispered the door knocker. "My master is coming soon, and then we will see." It laughed again. The front door of the house suddenly jerked open by itself and banged shut again. But George Thousand-Names hadn't given up. He raised his arms again and said, "The frost of the north will enclose you. The frost of the north will crack you. Coyote of the deserts will feel your chill and retreat like the hound he is." I still can't really believe what I saw then, but I'd already seen so much that night that one more weirdness couldn't faze me all that much. George Thousand-Names pointed directly at the door knocker with a rigid index finger, and out of that finger came a visible spangling cloud of ice. The ice settled on the door knocker, encrusting it with white crystals, and its hissing died away almost at once. Still, George Thousand-Names kept his finger pointed at the knocker, and the ice grew thicker and thicker. I could feel the cold from where I was standing, 2 or 3 feet away, and then, abruptly, the bronze head snapped, and pieces of frozen metal clattered onto the floor of the porch. George Thousand-Names let his arm fall. He was sweating and breathing in agonized gasps, but he had enough spirit left to kick at the fragments of door knocker with his foot and say, "A dotard, huh? You chunk of scrap." Dr. Jarvis let out a long whistle. "That was amazing. I never saw anything like that. Mr. Thousand-Names, you ought to get yourself a job in the frozen food business." I took George Thousand-Names' arm. "You won one," I said. "You took Coyote on, and you won one." George Thousand-Names shook his head. "We haven't finished yet, and my powers are not great. Dr. Jarvis, do you have space in your car for those pictures of Mount Taylor and Cabazon Peak?" "Why, sure, but I thought you were just going to seal off the house with a couple of spells." George Thousand-Names wiped his forehead with his handkerchief. I wish I could, Dr. Jarvis, but fighting that likeness of Coyote has made me realize that I haven't the strength. I'm too old, too weak. We're going to have to do it some other way. I pushed open the heavy front door, and we cautiously stepped inside. The pictures were still there. I said, "Right. Collect up as many as you can and stack them in the trunk. Then let's get going." Working swiftly and silently, we unhooked the prints and drawings from the walls and carried them down to the trunk of Dr. Jarvis's car. There must have been 60 or 70 of them, and by the time we had finished, the whole back of the car was weighed down with picture frames. Jane, who was still sitting in the rear seat, looked up and said, "Is everything all right? I feel very peculiar." "Don't you worry," said Dr. Jarvis. "We'll take you right back to the hospital for a checkup." "I'm fine, honestly. I think I'm just suffering from shock." "All the same," said Dr. Jarvis, "a medical once-over might be a good idea." He climbed into the car and started the motor. George Thousand-Names said, "We ought to find someplace safe for these pictures, someplace small that I can easily protect with spells." "How about my place?" I suggested. "I have a real small apartment, and if you stood behind the front door with a baseball club, you could keep the barbarian hordes at bay for a week." George Thousand-Names said, "That sounds good. Can you direct us there?" We drove over to my apartment building, and Sam the janitor eyed us with undisguised suspicion as we hefted all the pictures of Mount Taylor and Cabazon Peak into his elevator and took them upstairs. I unlocked my apartment door, and between us we stacked all the pictures in my small hallway under the poster of Dolly Parton. I stood back and brushed the dust off my hands and said, "Right, now, what about those spells?" George Thousand-Names said, "I'd like a drink first." We went through to my diminutive sitting room, and I opened up my black formica cocktail cabinet with the gold spangles on it and poured out 4 Hiram Walkers. I didn't really approve of bourbon made in Illinois, but it was all I had. All 4 of us stood there, tired and shaken, and swallowed it down like patent medicine. George Thousand-Names told me, "I'm going to hang this on your door." He took a small bone necklace out of his windbreaker pocket and held it up. It didn't look like anything special. The bones were old and chipped and discolored, and even though there had once been red and green paint on them, it had now mostly worn off. "This is the necklace worn by our ancient hero Broken Shield when he climbed Leech Lake Mountain and defied the thunder gods. Historically, it's beyond price. It may be 3,000 years old, but it was made to be used, and that's why I want you to have it tonight. Keeping Coyote away from Big Monster's scalp is far more important than any relic, no matter how much it means to us. Coyote will not dare to touch this. If he does, he will invoke the anger of Gitche Manitou, the Great Spirit himself." "I thought Coyote was the kind of demon who didn't mind defying anyone or anything," said Dr. Jarvis. "He is," agreed George Thousand-Names, "but like most vain and idle demons, he would rather live a quiet life, and the anger of Gitche Manitou would be quite enough to disturb his fun for the next 5,000 years." "Fun?" queried Dr. Jarvis, and shook his head in disbelief. "Dr. Jarvis," said George Thousand-Names, "just remember that to some of the fiercer demons, devouring a human is nothing more diverting than eating a bag of roasted peanuts is for us." George Thousand-Names hung the necklace on the handle of my front door and muttered a few incantatory words over it. Then he said, "I expect we're all tired and we want to be fresh for tomorrow. I suggest that we all get some rest. I had my maid make a reservation for me at the Mark Hopkins. Do you think you could give me a ride that way, Doctor?" "Sure," said Jim Jarvis. "How about you, Jane? Can I drop you off?" Jane had been sitting by herself on my favorite wicker chair. She said in a flat voice, No, that's all right. If John doesn't mind, I think I'll stay here. Mind? I asked her. You have to be joking. I haven't had female company here since my Aunt Edith came up from Oxnard and brought me a seed cake. George Thousand Names came over and shook my hand. He said softly, I want to thank you for having enough imagination to see what was really happening. At least we stand some kind of a chance. He and Dr. Jarvis were about to leave when my telephone rang. I beckoned them back inside and picked it up. John Hyatt. It was Lieutenant Stroud. So, you're back home, huh? I've been looking for you. Is that Indian with you? George Thousand Names, yes. The detective coughed, and then he said, We've had a little trouble on the Bay Shore Freeway just past Millbrae. The ambulance with Dr. Kane and Seymour Wallace's body in it was kind of ambushed. Ambushed? You mean by coyote? Lieutenant Stroud let out a testy breath. All right, if that's what you want to call it. The ambulance driver said he was driving along real normal, and suddenly this immense kind of a monster reared up in the roadway ahead of him. He was the only man to escape alive. Dr. Kane, I'm sorry to say, is dead, burned out like my patrolman. I put my hand over the telephone receiver and said to Dr. Jarvis, I'm sorry, Jim. Dr. Kane is dead. Coyote got to the ambulance just past the airport. George Thousand Names looked deadly serious. The blood, he insisted. Did he get the blood? I said to Lieutenant Stroud, Mr. Thousand Names wants to know if Coyote got the blood. Lieutenant Stroud coughed. Tell him that Seymour Wallace was found a half-hour later in the bay. He was so sucked out that the guy who hauled him out thought at first he'd found a dead shark. All I could say was, That's it then. What else can we do? Do you have any idea where Coyote is? Lieutenant Stroud said, We have an APB out, and the SWAT squad are checking every possible hideout, but if you ask me, it's going to be hopeless. Okay, Lieutenant, I told him, and laid down the phone. In the first smeary light of early morning that seeped into my room, George Thousand Names looked tired and hunched. He ran his gnarled fingers through his white hair and said, Let's hope we don't lose this one, friends. If Coyote gets loose, then I can't tell you what carnage there's going to be. Jane suddenly looked up and smiled, and I can remember thinking how strange that smile was. What the hell could there be to smile about? I made up a makeshift bed for Jane on the settee. I was too exhausted and shaken to think of seduction, and in any case, Jane was acting so withdrawn and remote that I could have yelled anything at the top of my voice, and all she would have said was, Pardon? She wrapped herself in a blanket and fell asleep almost straight away. I went around the apartment turning off the lights and drawing the curtains, but somehow I didn't feel much like lying down and closing my eyes. I went out into the hall and looked at some of the drawings of Mount Taylor. The glass in the frames was pretty dusty and stained, and most of the prints were badly foxed, but if you looked close you could see that someone had penciled under each one, Mount Taylor from Lookout Mountain, or Mount Taylor from San Mateo. There were similar notations under the pictures of Cabazon Peak, like Cabazon Peak from San Luis. I tiptoed across my sitting room and quietly took down my Random Valley road atlas. Then I crept back into the kitchen, closed the door, and spread it out on the table, along with as many pictures of Mount Taylor and Cabazon Peak as I could crowd around. I laid a sheet of grease-proof cooking paper over the map, took out my pen, and began to mark on the overlay the locations from which each of the views of the two mountains had been drawn. To keep myself going, I smoked half a packet of cigarettes and made myself a big mug of black coffee. as the sunlight outside the kitchen window grew stronger, and 8 o'clock chimed from the pine clock by the sitting room wall. By 9 I had almost every viewpoint plotted, and I lifted the sheet of greaseproof up and admired the pattern of tiny X's that I had marked all over it. I couldn't imagine what the heck they all meant, and there didn't seem to be any pattern to them that I could make out, but I guessed that George Thousand Names would probably be able to enlighten me. I tucked the paper in my trouser pocket and then crossed the kitchen to put the percolator on for another mug of coffee. I switched on the small black and white television that my mother had given me last Christmas, and after a couple of messages for sugar frosties and some kind of dumb plastic catapult for shooting Action Man over your neighbor's hedge, I caught a news bulletin about the ambulance that Seymour Wallace had been abducted from. The announcer said, San Francisco SWAT squad are still hunting for a ghoulish hijacker who ambushed an ambulance on its way to Redwood City Clinic from Elmwood Foundation Hospital and stole the cadaver of a former city engineer, Seymour Wallace. The hijacker, described by investigating detectives as armed and extremely violent, inflicted fatal injuries on Dr. Kenneth Kane, who was accompanying the body on its trip along Bayshore Freeway, and on Miguel Corralitos, a 27-year-old hospital orderly. The body of Mr. Wallace was later found by an early bird fisherman in the bay off Millbrae. So far, police have no clues to the hijacker's motives for purloining the corpse, but they promise fresh bulletins shortly. After that, they went into some report about orange blight in a fruit farm downstate, and I switched the television off. So, Coyote was still free, although I couldn't imagine what kind of form he had taken on now, or where he might be. What does a hideous demon do in the daytime? He can't very well roam the streets of San Francisco, especially with Lieutenant Stroud and the SWAT squad tracking him down. That's if he left any tracks. My percolator started gurgling and popping and gave me quite a start. I lit another cigarette and looked out over the backs of my apartment buildings around me. It was Sunday, and a pregnant girl in a smock was sitting on a fire escape, brushing her hair dry in the morning sunshine. I coughed and wished I could stop smoking. Right now, though, there didn't seem much point. If cancer didn't get me, Coyote probably would. The telephone rang. I lifted it up and said, John Hyatt. It was George Thousand Names, calling from the Mark Hopkins. He said, Did you sleep okay? I didn't sleep at all, I told him. I spent the rest of the night charting those viewpoints of Mount Taylor and Cabazon Peak. Does it look like anything interesting? Well, it could be, but I think it needs an interpreter. Do you want to come over? As long as you leave that necklace on the door, your place will stay safe. You're sure? Sure, I'm sure, said George Thousand Names. In any case, Coyote will probably be resting up right now, absorbing his blood into his system. I was wondering where demons go to in daytime. Demons are things of the dark, George Thousand Names told me. In sunlight, their powers are weakened, so you can bet that Coyote is holed up in some abandoned house someplace, or down in some culvert, or maybe he's even made it to 1551. Isn't it worth trying to flush him out, now that it's daylight? John, said George Thousand Names, when I say his powers are weakened, I don't mean that he doesn't have any powers. If we go near that creature, we're dead meat. I mean that. Thanks for the cheerful message. I'll come over in about an hour. I want to take a shower first. I smell like a pig. Okay, said George Thousand Names. Don't forget to bring the chart you made. I was just about to say, you bet, when the words died on my lips. The kitchen door had opened a small way, and there was something standing outside, watching me. I could see the glitter of dark eyes and an even darker shape. I felt as if the world had disappeared from under me, and every nerve in my body tingled and crept with fright. "Did you hear what I said?" said the tinny, distant voice of George Thousand Names. I said, "Wait! There's something outside my door. I don't know what it is. Wait!" "Which door?" he demanded. "The kitchen door! The kitchen door! It's—" The door slammed open so hard that splinters of wood and broken hinges flew across the room. I gave a high-pitched yelp and pitched off my chair, scrabbling across the floor towards the sink. I kept my knives there, in a drawer, and what I needed right now was instant protection. The beast came through that door like a tidal wave of black fur. It was a bear, a massive, full-grown grizzly, nearly 400 pounds of hair and muscle and vicious curved claws. It collided heavily with the kitchen units, and the television and percolator and spice racks clattered and crashed onto the floor. As the bear turned, it snarled viciously, and I wrenched open the kitchen drawer too quick and too hard, and let out a shower of knives and forks and bean slicers and apple corers all over the floor. I ducked down, caught hold of my biggest kitchen cleaver, and rolled as fast as I could towards the broken door. The bear paused and snarled again, and it was only then that I really looked at it. It was more than a huge beast of shaggy fur and dark animal smell. It had a pale white face, pale as a woman's, but with yellowish teeth that were bared with every snarl and growl. I stared at it, trying to understand what it was, what it could possibly be. I was so shocked and horrified that I couldn't grasp it at first, just couldn't get my mind around the fact of this terrifying beast's existence. It was Jane. Hard and ferocious though they were, those eyes were hers. That face was hers. The strange statuette on Seymour Wallace's banister post had come to life, and it was her. I whispered, "Jane!" She didn't answer, just snarled again and moved implacably towards me, her hard claws scratching on the kitchen lino. Saliva dripped from the points of her teeth, and there was nothing in her expression but blind animal hatred. "Jane, listen," I said in a croaky voice. All the time I was trying to back towards the door. I saw the muscles rippling under that coarse, glossy fur, and I knew that she was going to run for me again, and this time she probably wouldn't miss. There was a brisk tattoo of sharp claws, and the bear woman leaped towards me with the force of a huge black automobile. I know that I yelled out, but it was with aggressive desperation this time, the kind of "Banzai" scream they teach you in the army to pump your adrenaline up. As the giant bear hurtled towards me, I swung back my arm and whammed it straight in the face with the meat cleaver. That didn't do very much to help me. The force of the bear woman's leap banged me back against the wall, and we collided together on the floor in a ghastly embrace of blood and fur and claws. I think I was concussed for a moment, almost crushed, but then I managed to push some of the furry weight off my legs and hips and roll the bear woman over. I thought she was dead at first. The cleaver had struck her in the left side of the face, chopping a deep bloody V into her forehead and damaging her left eye. The velocity of her own leap had done the most harm, because there was no way that I could have hit anybody that hard. I knelt beside her, shaking and quaking and almost heaving up my last few mugs of coffee. She opened her right eye and looked at me. I twitched nervously and stood up, well away from those claws and those teeth. She smiled, a sort of sour, self-satisfied grin. "My master will want you now," she whispered. "He has waited so long for his beautiful bear maiden, and look what you have done. My master will track you down, and he will make sure that you die the worst death that anyone could ever imagine." I said thickly, "Jane?" But even if the face looked like Jane, there was nothing in the bear maiden's mind that remembered Jane or the way she used to feel about me. She lay there, panting and bleeding, but I knew that I hadn't killed her, and it was only a matter of time before she came after me again. The telephone said, "Hello, John?" I picked it up from the floor and said, "I'm here, George. I'm okay for now. The bear maiden's here. It's Jane. The bear maiden is Jane." George Thousand Names told me, "Get out of there, quick, while you still have the chance." "She's hurt. I hit her with the meat cleaver." "That's not going to please Coyote. Listen, just get your maps and go." Still stumbling and staggering, I gathered up my Rand McNally and my wallet and stepped over the bear maiden's twitching legs to the door. She rolled her eyeball up to watch me as I passed, and she whispered, "Coyote will get thee. Have no fear." I went out of the front door, made sure the necklace was tightly fastened around the handle, and headed for the elevator with wobbly knees. It was only after I'd hailed a taxi in the street and we'd pulled away into the traffic that I felt the first surge of real nausea. I tapped the driver on the shoulder. "Excuse me," I said. "I think I'm going to puke." She turned around and stared at me, a cigarette hanging from her lower lip. "Mister," she said, "this ain't no airline. Sick bags aren't provided." "What do you suggest I do?" I asked her, sweating. She drove at 40 miles an hour over a cross street, bouncing and jolting on the taxi's suspension. "Swallow it," she said, and that was the end of the discussion. I walked through the door of George Thousand Names' room at the Mark Hopkins. I said, "It's a nightmare. The whole damn thing is a nightmare." He was wearing a red satin bathrobe and slippers with beads sewn all over them. He looked as if he was starring in a cowboy movie financed by Liberace. He said, "That's the worst mistake you can make, to think it's a nightmare. If you think that, you will close your eyes to whatever happens and hope to wake up. But you are awake, John, and this is really happening." "But how the hell can a girl I know, a girl I used to love, damn it, a girl I still love, turn into a creature like that?" The old Indian set his glass down on top of the television set. I said, "She was a bear, George. She had hair all over her body, and there was only her face, and she didn't even recognize me. I couldn't say anything. She came right across that kitchen at me like a locomotive, and she would have killed me if I'd given her half a chance." George Thousand Names sat down on the edge of the bed. It didn't look slept in, but then I had heard that some Indians could sleep standing up. Maybe that was just an apocryphal story, but somehow I could just imagine George Thousand Names standing in the corner, arms crossed, snoring the night gently away. He said, "Between the time that you sent her to get the door knocker and the time that we found her on the 17th Street, Coyote must have assaulted her." I took a fiery swallow of bourbon. "Assaulted? I don't understand." George Thousand Names looked across at me with elderly concern. I was beginning to feel that if I could ever have had a choice of fathers, this man would have been it. He was compassionate and understanding, but he was also cynical and wise, and you knew that whatever he said was God's honest truth, or Gitche Manitou's honest truth. "Coyote is the most lustful of demons. He probably raped her. There is an old Navajo song about how Coyote meets a maiden on a mountain pass. It goes, "One day walking through a mountain pass, Coyote met a young woman. 'What have you in your pack?' she said. 'Fish eggs,' answered Coyote. 'Can I have some?' the maiden asked. 'Only if you close your eyes and hold up your dress.' She did as she was told. 'Higher,' said Coyote, and walked up to the woman. 'Stand still so I can reach the place.' 'I can't,' she said. 'There is something crawling between my legs.' 'Don't worry,' said Coyote. 'It's a scorpion. I'll catch it.' The woman dropped her dress. 'You weren't fast enough. It stung me.'" George Thousand Names had recited this song in a flat, monotonous voice. When he'd finished, he looked up at me and said, "You see, he is cunning as well as brutal. When I say assaulted, I probably mean seduced." I couldn't believe it. That thing we saw last night, that had sex with Jane? George Thousand Names nodded. Very probably. According to the legends, it was only after Coyote had filled her mind with the most evil ideas of antiquity that Bear Maiden grew hair and claws. I'm sorry, John, but if we're going to lick this thing, we've got to face the facts. Oh, sure. I felt bitter and upset. Of all people, why Jane? If I hadn't been dumb enough to send her on that fool's errand, she might have been safe. George Thousand Names went to the window and looked out over downtown San Francisco through his hotel drapes. "John," he said, "I know you take this personally, but you must understand that we're struggling with a life-and-death situation." I tried to smile. "It depends on whose life it is, doesn't it?" George Thousand Names shook his head. "Not whose life, but how many lives. There are people out there, John, thousands of them, and Coyote can turn this city into a dismal carnage. If he stays loose, these streets will look like a slaughterhouse before you know it. Coyote is a mad, random killer, John. A maniac beyond all maniacs. The only way to destroy him now is to outwit him and make absolutely sure that he can't find Big Monster's shorn-off hair. But all the pictures are round at my apartment." "You sealed the door with a necklace?" "Of course. Then Bear Maiden can't get out, and Coyote can't get in. At least, I hope not." I took out a cigarette and lit it. I needed something to steady my nerves. I said to George Thousand Names, "What do we do now?" He rubbed his chin. "I think we ought to discover where Big Monster's hair might be," he suggested. "Then we can go tackle Bear Maiden. She's ferocious enough, but I think I have spells that could hold her. After we've done that, we'll go looking for the big one, Coyote himself." "Well, I just hope we live this day out." George Thousand Names smiled. "The Costanoan Indians used to live here in San Francisco before the Spanish arrived. They had a prayer which began, 'When evening falls, give me the small darkness and not the great.'" I laid my road atlas on the table and produced the crumpled grease-proof overlay that I had painstakingly marked out that morning. We arranged the overlay on the map, and George Thousand Names scrutinized it like a skeptical art expert. He sniffed a couple of times, and his lips moved in a silent whisper as he located places and villages and mountains. After a while, he sat back on the arm of the hotel settee and frowned in deep concentration. "Well," I asked him, "what does it mean?" He glanced back at it. "I'm not sure. It's a very unusual arrangement of viewpoints, quite unlike the usual pictographs that Indians used to draw to locate waterholes. If you look here, you'll see that it's made of several symmetrical curves. Now, that just didn't happen when Navajos were making their charts of the desert areas. Time was too precious, and the countryside was too inhospitable. You made your pictures where you could, and you didn't worry about symmetry. So what does that prove? That it isn't genuine? George Thousand Names shook his head. No, we're certainly pointed in the right direction. The very fact that there's a pattern here is meaningful. What we have to work out is what the pattern means. How do we do that? George Thousand Names held the piece of greaseproof paper up to the window. Well, I have a feeling that what we're seeing here isn't a regular map. Those pictures of Mount Taylor and Cabazon Peak had a magical significance because they were the home of Big Monster. But I'm beginning to wonder if Big Monster's hair is hidden around that area or someplace else. He crossed the room and opened his brown pigskin suitcase. Then he came back to the table with a small glass vial of something that looked like black dust. I hope the supernatural doesn't embarrass you, he said. Why should it? Well, you're a white man, and it's a long time since white men understood the supernatural for what it really is. Having taken a chance on Jane's one-off theory about Coyote and Big Monster, and having traveled through the night to bring George Thousand Names down to San Francisco, I felt slightly irked at the suggestion that I was just another white bigot. But all I said was, one day the Indians are going to find out that not all pale-faces are mindless barbarians. George Thousand Names raised an eyebrow. Those Indians who are still left. We left that particular argument where it was. With Coyote loose, this was no time to do a big Wounded Knee number, but I knew that one day, if we escaped this thing alive, George Thousand Names and I were going to have to sit down and do some pretty serious talking. What Coyote's gruesome reincarnation had made me realize for the first time in my life was that America wasn't our land, not white land at all. The Spanish hadn't arrived in San Francisco until 1775. All those centuries before that, Indian lore and Indian magic had made this land what it was. There were demons and ghosts in them thar hills, but they weren't white, and they didn't take any heed of white man's magical powers. While I watched, George Thousand Names opened his glass vial and sprinkled blue-gray dust on my grease-proof paper map. He blew on it gently and whispered a few words. Then, right in front of my eyes, the dust shifted across the paper, just like iron filings drawn into patterns by a magnet. In a few seconds, it had marked out a pattern of curves that connected up the penciled crosses I had made from each of the original pictures. George Thousand Names studied the pattern and then smiled. Well, he said, wonders will never cease. What does it mean? I asked him. He pointed to the pattern with a stubby finger. That is a very ancient symbol. When I say ancient, I mean that it bears about as much relation to present-day Indian tongues as Middle English does to modern American speech. It is very difficult to express precisely, but what it means roughly is the place you will one day see from the north lodgepole of the teepee of the beast. I blinked. I don't think I'm any the wiser. George Thousand Names looked at me carefully. It's really very clear. The teepee of the beast is 1551 Pilarcitos Street. You remember how it worked out as 666? The north lodgepole simply means the view from the top of the house facing northwards. Whatever you see from that vantage point, that is where Big Monster's hair is hidden. Well, for God's sake, I said, what are we waiting for? Let's get up there. Give me 3 minutes to bathe and dress, George Thousand Names insisted. Meanwhile, you might give Dr. Jarvis a call and tell him where we're going. If he has the time, he'll probably want to come along. The old Indian went into the bathroom and ran the tub, while I sat down on the side of the bed and picked up the phone. I dialed Elmwood Foundation Hospital and asked to speak to Dr. Jarvis. The receptionist said, "I'm sorry, sir, Dr. Jarvis isn't here right now." "Is there any way I can reach him?" "I don't think so. He left here about 20 minutes ago with a young lady." I sighed. "Oh, okay. Can you leave him a message? Tell him John Hyatt called?" The receptionist said, "Oh, it's you, Mr. Hyatt. In that case, you may know where he's gone. He left with a lady friend of yours." "What did you say?" "A pretty-looking girl with long hair. Miss Torsino?" For a moment I couldn't think what to say or do. My mouth was very dry, and I felt distinctly bilious again, as if I'd been eating too many Japanese seaweed cocktail crackers. I put my hand over the phone and shouted, "George!" The medicine man appeared in the bathroom doorway, wrapped in a towel. "I just called the hospital. They told me that Jim Jarvis left about 20 minutes ago with Jane." George said, "What?" "That's what they told me." He began to rub himself quickly dry. "In that case, we have to move really fast. If Jane's gotten herself out of your apartment, then Coyote must know where to look for Big Monster's hair. All the pictures were there, right?" I said, "Thanks a million," into the phone and laid it down. Then I asked George, "What happened? I thought the necklace was supposed to keep her locked up." George Thousand Names stepped into a large pair of floral boxer shorts and then sat down on the bed to put on freshly creased linen slacks. The necklace was no guarantee. She may have found a way to shake it loose, or maybe a cleaner removed it. Even Coyote could have come by and persuaded someone to take it off. "But even so, George, she's a bear. How the hell can she walk the streets like a bear?" George Thousand Names laced up his brogues and reached for a smart blue blazer. "She's a bear, and she isn't a bear. The hair and the teeth and the claws are all the physical manifestations of the evil that Coyote has put into her mind, but they don't have to show themselves all the time. The Bear Maiden is a kind of Jekyll and Hyde creature. She changes according to her needs." "You mean she probably looks normal now, but she could change back into a bear at any time?" George Thousand Names nodded. "Do you think Coyote's gone up to 1551? "It's possible. In fact, if he's really managed to work out where Big Monster's hair is, I'd say it's a certainty." For quite a few moments, George Thousand Names and I sat and looked at each other, and both of us felt the fright and the burden of what we had elected to do. We didn't have to get involved. We could leave it all to Lieutenant Stroud and take the next plane to Honolulu. But somehow we both felt that now Coyote had brought this evil into our lives, there was only one way to go, and that wasn't off to Hawaii. "George," I said quietly, "is there any way at all that we can wipe Coyote out? Is there any weakness anywhere that we can attack?" George Thousand Names stared at the carpet. "I thought the necklace would work, but it obviously hasn't. Maybe Coyote's gained some new powers since he's been in hibernation. His only real soft spot, or so the legend says, was for Bear Maiden. And that isn't exactly a weakness, because Bear Maiden was always so devoted to him." "What about Big Monster's hair?" "Well, that's the greatest threat of all," said George Thousand Names. "Once he finds it, that will give him all the strength he needs, and immortality, too. If that happens, we might as well pack up our bags." "Well, supposing we found it first?" The Indian shrugged. "Even if we did, we couldn't do much with it." "Couldn't we wear it ourselves? Wouldn't it give us strength?" George Thousand Names looked at me as if I was totally bananas. "If a mortal man attempts to wear the scalp of a giant or a demon, he will be destroyed by what he sees. In other words, for as long as he could survive it, which wouldn't be long, he would become a demon himself, and his mind just couldn't take it. Or so the Hualapai Indians say, or at least they used to. I reached for another cigarette. Okay then, we'd better get ourselves up to Pilarcitos. Doing anything is better than doing nothing. Okay then, thank you for listening to this week's story. And we only have one chapter left, so next weekend will be the final chapter of the Charnel House. So they got a lot to do between now and then. So I hope you'll join us next week for the final chapter of the Charnel House. And until then, have a great week, everyone.